Okay, so in this lecture, I want to go through arguments by refutation, or refuting other people's arguments. And this is a strategy, or these are strategy used when you want to show what the other person says isn't true, right? Now, look, when you do that, one thing to be clear about is all that these arguments, all that these forms of arguments accomplish, even if successful, is a sort of negative result, right? You have undermined or at best disproven what the other person says. You haven't really offered any positive proof for your own claims, right? You know, if you're trying to establish a conclusion, knocking down what the other person says is not enough, right? But, it is a first step, right? If you can undermine their argument, then you're in a position to offer your own positive argument for the opposed position, right? Um, but just remember, you still need to do that. You haven't accomplished anything positive. You haven't really proven that much just by undermining the other person's argument. There's a lot of people online, well, trolls generally, who think that, just by knocking down someone else's argument, they've proven their own. That's not true, right? There's very limited what these accomplish, but it is worthwhile sometimes. Okay. So look, as is often the case with arguments by refutation, a lot of these styles of argument are things that we do anyway. I'm guessing you've made arguments like this before you ever took this class, right? And what we want to do in a logic class is to make it more explicit what's going on and why these arguments work when they do. All right, so let me give you one example of an argument involving refutation, or one example of a refutation. So when I was a kid, I think my mom was terrified that I was going to drop out of school or something, right? I wasn't crazy about school, especially elementary school. I complain a lot about it. I mean, this is probably not an admission that a college professor should make. I really didn't like it, right? Anyway, so, my mom would just, offer me arguments, and I remember one of them she offered me was, you have to at least finish high school or you can't be successful, right? You can't be successful unless you have a high school diploma. And my response was to bring up the case of, her brother who dropped out of school in the 8th grade, my Uncle Rich, right? I said, well, look, Uncle Rich is successful. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade. He didn't finish high school. So, that can't be true, right? Now, look, I don't know what my mom said in response. I'm sure if you ask her, she has a memory of this argument where she offered some devastating response. Whatever. That might be true and I might have blocked it. Who knows? Point being, what young me is doing, kind of snottily, is offering a counterexample, right? She's making this universal claim, you need a high school diploma to be successful, and I'm trying to show that that's not true, right? Look, again, you don't accomplish anything positive with this. I just undermine her argument. I am by no means, even if little me was right about this, I'm by no means showing that dropping out of high school is a good idea, right? All right, so think about what my mom's doing, right? Think about, and you can even think about this in terms of some of the things we've talked about, right? Think about necessary and sufficient conditions. What kind of claim involving necessary or sufficient conditions is she making? Think about that a second. Well, in effect, what my mom is saying is that it is a necessary condition for being successful that you have a high school diploma, right? Other ways of saying this, other ways of thinking about it, are to basically say, well, you can't be successful without a high school diploma, In our logical language of symbols, not HX, H doesn't have a high school diploma, then SX, X is not successful. Well, this is, as claims about necessary and sufficient conditions are, this is a very general claim. This is a universal claim. And so it's enough to undermine her argument if I can show one case where somebody is successful and they don't have a high school diploma. I give the example of my uncle. I've given a counterexample to her claim about it being a necessary condition, right? Another example using sufficient conditions. I won't give you guys the logical breakdown with symbols, but think about it, right? Ken says getting a degree in economics means you'll be successful. Ken was the name of a professor who taught economics at UVA, whatever. Mitch, he might say, well, look, my friend Matt from high school has an econ degree and he lives in his mom's basement, right? In this case, Ken is making a claim about a sufficient condition. Getting an economics degree is a sufficient condition for being successful. Basically, if you have an economics degree, then you will be successful. It's enough to refute that to show one example of someone who does have an economics degree and isn't successful, right? If we assume, we can argue about what the definition of success is, but if we assume, as Mitch does, that living in your mom's basement means you are not successful, right? Well, so these are how counterexamples are supposed to work. One more example, a somewhat more serious example of a counterexample. Let's take this one that says, well, it is always wrong to intentionally kill another human being. Physician-assisted suicide is intentionally killing another human being, so physician-assisted suicide is wrong. So argument starts with this blanket claim, it is always wrong to intentionally kill another human being. Counterexample, killing in self-defense is not wrong, right? We would all agree if someone is literally going to hack you to bits with an axe and you have a gun and the only way to stop him from chopping you to bits with an axe is to shoot him, it is morally acceptable to shoot him, right? We can argue, and there are huge philosophical arguments about what legitimate self-defense is and isn't, but in the axe murderer case where it's very clear the other person is going to kill you if you don't kill them, unless you're a saint, you would say killing in that case is morally acceptable. It's not morally wrong. Okay, so counterexamples are pretty simple. Now, as your book notes, the problem with counterexamples is that they only work for universal claims. And I mean, they're pretty useful, right? A lot of times, especially in moral argument, moral claims tend to be pretty universal in form. You give a counterexample, the other person is going to have to make some adjustments, right? We'll talk about what kinds of adjustments they might make, how you can respond to reductio arguments or counterexamples at the end of the lecture. But, counterexamples are a pretty useful form of argument in philosophy, right? They come up a lot in ethics. They come up a lot in other fields of philosophy, right? And to the extent that we argue about morality in everyday life, counterexamples are pretty darn useful, right? Take math classes, counterexamples pop up a lot there. Somebody says something about an equation, you plug in some value where it doesn't equal what it's supposed to. That shows that that's false, right? So counterexamples very useful, but they are limited, right? If the other person isn't making a universal claim, counterexample doesn't work, right? Somebody's making a claim about necessary or sufficient conditions, works just fine. If they're not, even if they're making a deductive argument, a counterexample won't really work, right? And now especially, if they're not even trying to make a deductive argument, if they're trying to make an inductive argument, counterexamples prove nothing, right? If my mom had just rephrased it, and this is probably what she did, and said, well, it's really unlikely you'll be a success without a high school diploma. The fact that one person wouldn't prove anything, right? It's just the fact that she's made this universal claim. All right. But anyway, another form of refutation what do you do when the other person isn't making universal claims? Or when it's just not so easy to come up with a counterexample to show why it's absurd off the bat? Reductio ad absurdum is another form of refutation, and it works in the same basic way as a counterexample, but it involves a little more work. What you do with a reductio argument, you don't just offer a counterexample, an instance, that should be wrong according to their logic and is not. What you do with a reductio argument is you take the premises or the commitments of their theory or their argument or whatever, and you show that you can use them to prove a conclusion that the other person would reject, a conclusion that they would admit is false. And not just false, reductio ad absurdum, literal from the Latin, is reduction to the absurd. It's a conclusion that is absurd or revolting or just silly, right? You show that if we accept their argument or theory, the things they're saying, this other thing that is just obviously false would have to be true as well. And that's supposed to give us a reason to reject their theory or argument or their commitments. Now that's all pretty abstract. Let's see how this actually works with a few examples of reductio arguments. So here's just one I lifted from your book. Your book talks about an argument that two MPs, members of parliament, are having in the British Parliament about the death penalty. So MP1 says, well, life in prison is a harsher punishment than the death penalty, so it would be cruel to replace the death penalty with life in prison. MP2 says, well, all right, murderers ought to receive the worst punishment, right? So if life in prison is worse than the death penalty, we ought to give the worst murderers the life sentences because you've just said it's worse, and we ought to give less serious offenses the death penalty, right? Now, what this second MP is doing is not trying to show that we should have more of the death penalty. We should give it out for, say, embezzlement or whatever. What he's trying to show is, well, your argument, MP1, has these stupid or, silly or just awful conclusions if we take it to its logical conclusion, so we ought to reject your argument. Here's another example of a reductio argument. So libertarians, people think the government shouldn't do anything except basically have the police and army. So libertarian philosophers will often say, we have duties not to harm other people, right? We have duties not to make them worse off, but we have no duties to help them, right? I shouldn't make you worse off, but I have no duty to do anything to help you at all, right? So they'll say, well, so the rich do not owe the poor any assistance. Means that the rich shouldn't have to do anything to help the poor, right? Well, so Peter Singer, fairly famous philosopher, famous for a philosopher is a relative term. A famous philosopher is probably less famous than a not so famous relief pitcher, but whatever. Anyway, Peter Singer, who's famous for a philosopher, says, well, look, let's take the premises of libertarian's argument. If we really have no duties to help people, then imagine you see a child drowning in shallow water. Well, if you have no duties to help people, then you would do nothing wrong if you think to yourself, oh man, that water looks cold. He's not my kid. It's muddy. These are nice pants. Stinks for you, kid, right? And just walk off. Why? Well, look, you're not making the kid worse off. You didn't put him in the water to start with. He would drown if you're not there, so you're not harming him. The only way you could have done something wrong in this case is if you had a duty to help him and you failed to live up to this duty to help him, right? So Singer would say, unless you want to say that someone who just watches and lets this child drown or walks off because they don't want to ruin their nice pants or get their legs cold, unless you want to say that person has done nothing wrong, then obviously it's not right to say we have no duties to help others. Hopefully you guys get an idea of how reductio arguments work. So your book doesn't really talk about this, and I'm not going to go into the details. I'm not going to try to put the reductio arguments I'm giving you guys in like a rigorous, deductively valid form, not one using symbolic logic especially. But I think it is worth talking about the logical form of reductio arguments. So the logical form of reductio arguments, and basically the logical form of counterexamples too, is basically using modus tollens, right? Which we talked about several lectures ago. Basically, you're trying to show that if the theory or claim or whatever the other person's saying is true, then this other thing that we know to be false is true as well. So that means that their theory can't be true, right? Remember, if A, then B, not B, so not A. It's a valid form of argument. Well, what's wrong with this, though? Why might this fail to prove your conclusion? Why might this fail to refute the other person? Well, let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about how people might respond to reductio arguments. So how might people respond to reductio arguments and counterexamples? There's basically three ways they can respond. Now, the first one is, of course, what you want when you give an argument that's meant to refute them, which is they give up, right? They give up their argument, theory, or claim, or whatever. They say, okay, well, that's absurd. I can't accept that. Obviously, my argument went wrong somewhere. Now, this sometimes happens, but, in real life, it's rarely that simple. The more common move is to modify it to avoid the counterexample or reductio argument. And think about how people might do this, right? Think about my argument about physician-assisted suicide, right? Person might say, well, okay, it's wrong to kill another human being except in self-defense. And, well, physician-assisted suicide, when a doctor helps a terminally ill person die, that's not self-defense, so physician-assisted suicide is wrong. Or, my mom might have said to me, well, look, you're right, I was wrong, I should rephrase that. What I should say is, well, your Uncle Rich dropped out of high school in the 1960s, it's the 1990s now. You can't possibly be successful without a high school diploma in the 1990s, right? That would avoid my counterexample, and, I would have to think of something else, right? I could probably find somebody who, did it in the 90s who is successful, but at least, would have to work to find another one. You can do the same with reductio arguments, a little more complicated, but try to rework your premises so that the person can no longer get this absurd conclusion from them. Now, the final thing you can do in the face of a counterexample or an absurd conclusion is to just accept it, right? You can do what philosophers call biting the bullet. And the thought, behind this image, biting the bullet, we think of somebody in these awful Westerns or Civil War films biting on a bullet as they have their legs sawed off, right? It's where the whole metaphor comes from, right? It's supposed to be really unpleasant, but it is a possible response to these kinds of arguments. The libertarian could say to Singer, yeah, all right, well, fine to let the kid drown. My mom could say to me, she's not going to do this because I'm, gossipy little kid, I'm going to go tell her brother if she says this. I could say, well, She can say, well, your uncle's not really successful, right? I mean, he actually is, but whatever. You know, if you wanted to say that, if you just wanted to deny the truth of the counterexample or just accept the absurd conclusion, then the argument doesn't work, right? And think back to the logic. The logical form of a reductio, if A then B, not B, so not A. This only works if not B is true. This only works if not B is true, which means B is false. If the person accepts B, then the argument doesn't work, right? The whole point of a reductio or a counterexample is supposed to be that B is so absurd, so crazy, or just so uncomfortable for them that they can't, that no sane person could. But if they do, then the argument doesn't work. So I think, what I want to end on is just a few more thoughts about reductios and counterexamples. And one is just how to come up with good ones. So good counterexamples and reductios. The person must accept the truth of the counterexample or reject the truth of the conclusion of the reductio argument. So for counterexamples, what that means is you want to choose counterexamples you are confident the other person accepts. You want your counterexamples to be as plausible, as ironclad as possible. You want to offer a counterexample not just that you think is true, but that you think any sane, decent human being would have to admit, right? Think about the physician-assisted suicide one, right? One response people sometimes have to this, they'll say, well, a counterexample is, well, killing people as a punishment for crime, executions, that's justified, so that's a counterexample. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's not as good a counterexample as the self-defense one. Why not? Well, almost no one is going to reject the claim killing in self-defense is morally acceptable. Very few people will do it. They're either trying to irritate their philosophy teacher by proving a philosophical point, or they are complete saints. I'm never sure which. But few people are going to say that, right? A lot more people will deny that executing people as a punishment for crime is justifiable. That means that the self-defense one is a much better counterexample. Final one, design your reductio argument so the conclusion is as implausible or silly or awful as possible, right? You might get the libertarian argument and you might say, well, okay, if the rich have no duties to help those who are less well off, then, we shouldn't have Medicare or Social Security, right? And the libertarian might just say, well, yeah, I don't think we should have those, right? It's a lot harder to deny. It's a lot harder to deny that somebody who lets a child drown in shallow water is an awful person, right? In that case, it's a much better counterexample than some of the other ones people have thrown at the libertarian argument. That's why Singer's is so memorable. If the supposedly awful conclusion is as implausible or honestly silly as it's supposed to be, then the other person, unless they're just trying to offer it for the sake of argument and be irritating, they can't really accept it. It will be obviously false. Now, one final thing on reductio arguments. They present us with a choice. We can either reject our claim or theory or accept the absurd conclusion. Now, remember, one of the things I said that was kind of weird when we talked about the conditional is that not A or B is logically equivalent to if A then B. And that just seems a little weird to a lot of us, right? Those two statements don't mean the same thing. When you think about reductio arguments, I think you can see a little bit more about why we say this. Because a reductio argument does have this if A then B form, but a reductio argument in a sense offers us a choice. We can either reject our theory or argument or claims, A here, the not A in our, disjunction, or we can accept B, B being the supposedly absurd or silly or horrible claim. Now look, one thing I'll note is that a lot of times, so-called biting the bullet is just something people do out of stubbornness to accept, just to prove a point or fail to accept a point for somebody else, right? But sometimes when our theories or claims have supposedly absurd results, we should ask ourselves, is it always so clear what our choice is, right? Do we really want to reject the theory or rework the theory to avoid this choice, or do we maybe want to accept the absurd result? A lot of times we don't, but there is a choice here. And sometimes people should accept the supposedly absurd conclusion. I'll give you guys an example. I don't understand the math or science well enough to really go into this in great depth, but when Einstein developed the theory of relativity seemed to have the result that the then current theory about how the universe formed was wrong. Theory at the time said the universe had just always existed, it had always been the same size, it wasn't expanding, wasn't contracting. Einstein saw this, and he thought, oh no, this can't be right. This is a counterexample to my theory. This is a reductio of all these premises of my theory. I need to rework relativity so it doesn't have this result. Now, it actually turns out that the scientific theory that was common at the time, the so-called steady-state theory of the universe, was just wrong. The universe was, in fact, expanding. It still is. By not accepting that, by not accepting the absurd conclusion, Einstein actually deprived himself of a really great discovery, right? He could have beat everybody to the punch and shown, well, the universe is expanding. He said, in his later years, this was the dumbest mistake I ever made, basically. So sometimes when faced with an apparent reductio, we should at least ask ourselves, is it so absurd, or maybe do we want to accept the conclusion on grounds of our theory? One final thing I'll say is, logic can't tell you what the right choice is here. All logic can do is show you that you, in fact, do face a choice. All right, maybe that's a little depressing, but if simply taking logic made us always know the right choice, well, it would be a lot easier to avoid mistakes than it in fact is. All right, so hopefully that all makes sense. We'll go into more depth in that when we, have our Zoom session.